Hi, this is Bernie Power from Melbourne School of Theology. And in this series, we're going to look at the voices from the ground, hear the voices from some people who are living in or closely connected with Israel, Palestine, and talking about this conflict that's going on to give us some insights of the things that they're going through, how they're thinking about things, and what they're doing. So I hope you find it really helpful. My guest today, Evan, I might get you to introduce yourself. Do you want to tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. Greetings, Bernie, and those tuned in for this. I'm happy to be with you. My name is Evan Thomas. I am an Israeli, a Jewish follower of the Messiah, and I am a founder and leader of a Messianic congregation in the coastal city of Netanya, right in the center of the country. I have over 40 years of pastoral ministry behind me and have been very proactive from my earliest years in the establishment of various areas of key ministry in the land, including the National Bible School, national evangelism and missions. And a key work that I've been involved in for over 35 years was in the area of reconciliation ministries, particularly between Palestinian Christians and Messianic Jews.
So maybe let's go the war between Israel and Hamas. Can you tell us how has it affected you and your family?
Well, I think starting with the key date of October 7th, in the early morning, our team was setting up for our Shabbat service. Within the Messianic community, we generally have our worship services on a Saturday, which we call Shabbat, preparing to travel. And then the news came in, we're under rocket barrages, and there'd been a major infiltration into the southern settlements. So I had to call the team to quickly pack up and head home before the home front command scooped them up and sent them on their way. And so began the whole season of uncertainty and rapidly into the declaration of war. Fairly early in the peace, southern settlements were evacuated, and one of the key ones was a small city or large town, let's say, called Sderot, which is very, very close to the northern borders of Gaza. And that town was evacuated, and the evacuees were bussed up to Netanya, or fled in their cars, because the city was literally under attack from the 7th. How that impacted us, Netanya is right in the center of the country, and we're sort of regarded, at least at this stage, as somewhat of a safe corridor. And so, perfect place for displaced from the south and the north to find a safe haven. And so they moved in with their families into small hotel rooms and they packed every available space, and then impacted our community and another half dozen Messianic communities spread around Netanya. Was simply, first of all, to take a corporate role in intercessory prayer for both Israel. At that stage, we, of course, were not committed into a ground invasion into Gaza, although that looked inevitable at some point. They were still embattled in the southern settlements because of the large forces numbers of forces that came in. So prayer was a big issue, which of course empowers the community of faith, giving you a sense that you are doing something. And of course, in our case, in Netanya, we suddenly had a massive social challenge on our hands, something that the government alone or even the municipality alone could not handle by itself. So that enabled us to mobilize as communities with humanitarian aid. In our particular case, with our congregation, we call it Beit Asaf, the House of Asaf. And actually our daughter, who is a trained trauma therapist and specialist, quickly joined a team of other social workers, and they were assigned various centers or hotels where they quickly began to take stock, going from room to room, floor to floor, checking the families, their situation. Most of them had just come away with virtually nothing. with the kids and all. And they were trained to make lists of needs, clothing, shoes, baby. Some of them were in the throes of having babies. And so people like our daughter and her team members, they really helped us within our Messianic communities by giving lists. So people like myself immediately went to putting out appeals for help abroad and from within the community itself. So we had finances to be able to do some, large scale purchasing. And you're talking about every center having hundreds and hundreds of families, quite a task. And then mentioning my daughter, people like her and her colleagues then were also, as they went from room to room, were able to assess the emotional needs as well. And as people fled from, brutal situations, some of them had, lost family members or seen neighbors and family members gunned down, brutalized in the streets in front of them. And so they were terrified, traumatized. You had situations where my daughter finding families where dad was away with one of the military divisions in the south, and she was stuck with the kids in a hotel room, and she wouldn't allow them out of her sight, out of the room even, just that sense of needing to protect. And that work's just gone on and on and on. Of course, we've pretty much now met all the physical needs, let's say, because it was a season moving into the winter season and needing warmer clothes and this sort of thing. And of course, they're not allowed back and down south to their homes. And so those are met, but of course the needs are endless with regards to, the needs to be treating people and supporting them emotionally, in particular. So you ask how it impacted us. Of course, Israel, when it is in a state of war, an interesting thing happens. It has a very unifying effect on the local population. So even within our local neighborhoods and so on, we're suddenly getting out there on the playgrounds with the kids, and parents getting to know one another, supporting one another. So there's the positive side of it. But of course, the catalyst for it is people living with a lot of uncertainty. We are and continue to be fortunate that business as usual in our area, at least, people were getting out and getting to work and to their businesses, with some exceptions. Staffing problems, of course, a lot of reservists called up. And so you would see certain shops and businesses shut down or services limited. But we were largely able to continue, unlike many other cities, like in the north or, of course, in the south.
Yeah, so I heard figures like 250,000 people had become refugees from the north just to get away from when the hostilities started up there as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Did people have a sense that this might happen? Did you live with a feeling that at some stage this might occur, or did you feel that things were quite stable and it was totally took everyone by surprise?
I think the human psyche is an interesting thing. Even if you did have a sense of living day to day, it was a typical Israeli mindset, you also live with a certain level of denial. Now, that also was not helped. And let me just give a tiny bit of context, a few seconds here. The country itself, militarily and politically, was not ready for this. And I think that created a framework of a great opportunity for Hamas to use that context to actually launch the assault, because most of the defense battalions had been moved away from the Gaza area and through the West Bank. That was seen by the Prime Minister and the military to be the higher priority. Also, the surveillance centers around the Gaza border on the settlements there were not taken seriously. And although that they had actually seen for a couple of months that something was up, but general Israeli public had no idea. So it completely took us by surprise. And when those initial rocket barrages began, people just could not believe it.
Mm.
And that's despite, in fact, we have a record of every couple of years or so, another war with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the rocket barrages and infiltrations. It's not that we were strangers to it, but I think you live with a sense of denial. You don't want to imagine that you're going to be sending your sons and daughter in harm's way into the battlefront. And nor do you want to be in a situation where inevitably you're going to be causing enormous harm to the population on the other side of the border. And that's what war does. I think it was 3 weeks before the ground invasion began, simply because of our lack of readiness, and one does not go to an urban warfare situation unprepared. That has disastrous results, as history has proven. So once that began, follow up from all the aerial bombardment, it impacts the heart, because you know of the terrible suffering it causes on the other side, inevitably. And among those, Christian brothers and sisters whom we know. And if we don't know them, then our colleagues and friends from within the West Bank Palestinian Christian communities, they're relatives. They're lamenting because their dear friend, the organ player of the little Baptist church in central Gaza, was killed, and it becomes very personal, an enormous conflict of emotions, because the conflict of your loyalties, the horror of what October 7th meant to us as Israelis, the mixed loyalties within the Arab-Israeli Christian community, especially in the early stages of the war, showed enormous solidarity with the Jewish neighbors and Messianic community. We had prayer meetings where we would have 120 pastors, and 50% were Arab Christian ministers there, praying together and supporting one another, encouraging one another. Because at the end of the day, we knew that if the northern front opened up, which it has at least in part, that their communities also would be under threat. So our Palestinian Christian colleagues and friends in the West Bank, where their loyalties are enormously torn, struggling to deal with the rapidly rising numbers of victims amongst the Palestinian communities of the Gaza Strip.
So let's go back a little bit in history. As you mentioned before, you've kind of lived with a sense of this, but there's always been a long history of conflict and violence within the Middle East, and particularly around Israel. What do you think are the roots of this?
It depends on your perspective. Some of what I might share now can seem quite abstract, and some of it is based in reality of this very complex conflict, which is far more modern. I'm cautious about putting too much interpretation on biblical history, because it's just that, it's interpretation. The fact is that realities on the ground is that we can live as neighbors. I think the term most used by media is coexistence. We have plenty of times of very great success in coexistence, and even many of our cities reflect that. The real roots of the conflict are far more modern and should be treated that way. I think that's more helpful, rather than trying to date it back into jealousies between brothers and sons of Abraham and these kinds of issues. Notwithstanding, we do have a real collision of cultures and religion. Islam and its values and its doctrines are pretty much antithetical to Christian values and theology, where the emphasis is so much on an interpretation of justice, on the Christian side of forgiveness. But in the middle, you've got Jewish thinking and worldview, some of which in the background, of course, is the Holocaust and the state of Israel birthed on the basis of the Holocaust. Enormous Jewish suffering and that sense of victimhood and never again, and the sense of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And that's at the core of Judaistic thinking, whether you are secular or religious. Of course, it's much more so for religious Jews. And they're a powerful political force today in Israel politics. A government where you have very strong, very right-wing religious factions who are government ministers. And so you've got these enormous religious and cultural conflicts going on. And the context of the conflict, as you rightly put it, dates back generations now.
Would you go as far back as like Muhammad and the beginnings of Islam?
Only in as much as the development of religious values that will inevitably be in conflict with one another. But history will teach us always that, in fact, where Muslims and Jews have coexisted, let's say in European countries, they've done so actually very successfully, more successfully than Jews and Christians. Of course, that sort of Jewish-Christian conflict also is expressed, at least in part, within the background to the Holocaust. The Jews and Muslims have got on actually reasonably well. So, no, I wouldn't want to put too much import on there. I think the issues are far more politically and nationalistically based. So you go back and examine Yasser Arafat, his colleagues, the refugees into Jordan, the formation of Fatah, being driven out of Jordan into southern Lebanon, the massacres that took back, and the lashback. A lot of those things are based in Arab nationalism and particularly Palestinian nationalism. So that's why I put far more emphasis on the more modern issues of conflict. Yes, they do have historical background, but not all of it was bad. That's all I'm saying from that point of view.
You mentioned the concept of Palestinian nationalism, and say early last century, as the Jews came into the land, this whole concept of ownership of the land and conflict between the Arabs and the Jews about that. Do you have any kind of thoughts or insights on what happened in that time?
What I've tried to do, because of my background in conflict resolution, I learned early on how important it was to listen and examine the narrative of the other, of the person that or people group that you're in conflict with. And so my narrative as a Jew and as an Israeli is the narrative of Atzmaut, of having an independent nation, homeland of our own. So coming refugees out of Holocaust Europe particularly, and then also subsequently out of North African countries as well, as Arab nationalism grew, Ba'ath Party and many others, that it became very difficult for Jewish people to live in Morocco, the Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and so forth. And then the European survivors and children of survivors from the Holocaust coming into the land. And our whole concept of a homeland again, we're coming home to Zion, we have a sanctuary, a safe place. But on the other side, in conflict with my narrative, is the narrative of Nakba, the narrative of the horror of displacement.
Not aware the word Nakba is Arabic for catastrophe and refers to the events.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. So here we learn that we have these parallel narratives going on in the same time. So as we're gaining independence and a footing and recognition internationally, the pain of the catastrophe of Nakba is part of the narrative of every Arab, Palestinian, Christian or Muslim. And many of my friends and colleagues amongst the Christian communities, both in the West Bank, Palestine, or within Israel proper, they're either the sons and daughters at my age group, sons and daughters of those that were refugees, either pushed across Jordan itself to Amman, whose families remain until today. And I've met many of them, or amongst the Christian communities, say at Beit Shan, they were bussed up to Nazareth, and there they stayed in Galilee communities. They live with that narrative, but fortunately, because they were bathed also in the Christian narrative and principles of forgiveness, which were very strong, particularly amongst evangelical mission work that went on amongst the Galilee and central Israeli Christian communities. They found a way of living with the new reality, even though that it was difficult for them even to theologically justify. For them, the principles of the cross, of forgiveness and so forth, were the tenets of their faith, were the mainstay of their faith. On the other side, from the Jewish side, even those of us that are followers of Messiah, the emphasis would be less on those issues and more on understanding our biblical history and a right of homeland. In other words, not being able to separate ourselves from our living in and defense of this homeland. Mm-hmm. Hence the whole development of Christian Zionism, of course. I'm being pretty simplistic here. But the Messianic community very much bought into that because it strengthened or reinforced our understanding, our perspective of who we were. There was already enough conflict, faith conflict, in trying to understand who we were as Jews and as followers of the Messiah. So we weren't quite Christians, but we belonged to the broader international Christian community. As our communities grew in size and sophistication and infrastructure and so on, that sense of belonging and right to belong was also reinforced. Fortunately, there was quite a group of us that felt it was very necessary to take our principles that we preached and taught on the kingdom of God, on the Beatitudes of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and to see those reflected in our relationships with our brothers and sisters whose communities we are at times in conflict with. So that's the tensions that we live with. Now, you put that into the context of full-scale war, and though all of those things, all of those grand principles and your relationships are put to the test, I'm thankful that by and large, despite often the internal tearing we feel in terms of loyalties to our broader communities, respectively, we are maintaining until today a strong level of unity and coordinated prayer, help and support to one another. Every week on a Wednesday morning, I'm with a unity prayer forum of other pastors from West Bank, from around the Galilee, Jerusalem, Arabs and Jews together. We go down deep with our prayers together. Yeah.
I live in Melbourne, Australia, and we have a strong Muslim community around us. And I was talking to our butcher the other day. His name is Jihad the butcher. And he, as we were discussing this, it became very heated. And he said, well, what right did the Jews have to come in and take Palestinian land? How would you respond to that claim?
I think partly answered out of the narrative that we carry, in that sense of we've come home to the homeland, to the Jewish homeland. There's that sense of right and righteousness about that. Unfortunately, politically and socially, that's so often abused. I'll be blunt about it. Hence the question, what right then do we have? And I always look back actually to a good biblical model, a good biblical example in Abraham. when seeking places to land or suitable places to as burial sites for his wife and for himself eventually, although he had been promised, so to speak, by God the land, he nevertheless bought the land, paid for it as burial sites. In our situation, the issue of land tenure is extremely important. Someone's olive plantation, if it's then taken, bulldozed, or ripped out for the sake of, let's say, building a settlement or creating a safe zone for a Jewish settlement, which has been taken by, let's say, force, then what we're seeing is an abuse of that sense of righteousness that the land is ours. Because we're also taught biblically, and here I'm talking Hebrew scriptures, not New Testament principles, but Hebrew scriptures, we're taught how important respect and honoring and care for the stranger in the land, those that are not Jewish around us. We have as much responsibility for them. So coming in and taking land and claiming it, under a divine right is an abuse of the very principles actually we're taught through Hebrew scripture. So that's my answer to jihad. He has every right to be very angry. I am convinced, as many Israelis, not just believers, today, our policies and current policies vis-a-vis Palestine, Palestinians, coexistence, so forth, they've failed. And I think this war with Hamas, more than anything else, really has brought it home to us that this calamity that's befallen Israel now has brought it home to us that our policies and values have failed, and we must change those. Otherwise, we're destined for further calamity and, God forbid, even regional war. So that's why I've placed it all in a more modern context, the historical, biblical context notwithstanding.
So would you oppose the UN has condemned Israel many times for the building of new settlements? Would you stand with them on that?
I do, in the way that it's done. Settlement and progress and developing industry together where there's mutual benefit and good coexistence, because we proved that it can and does happen. But when it's so abused, which it has been, I'm first to criticize own governments in their handling of these things and not monitoring well the radical elements of Israeli society that have that sense of divine right that they can do this, and this is Israel's destiny. I totally oppose that, and so do an ever-increasing number. However, our nation is split on these issues, as we've seen in media during this war. There's a huge protest movement throughout Israel for a year leading up to the war. There's this government coalition of right-wing religious personalities and movement leaders, people like Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and many others, who are using this as a platform and an opportunity to push further for Israeli settlement, Jewish settlement, in a very controversial way. I, like many of my colleagues, stand absolutely in opposition of that.
Just recently, Netanyahu's come out saying he didn't think that the two-state solution was viable anymore. What's your feeling about that?
I'm torn about this issue of one state or two-state solution. Ideally, I'm more of an ideologue, an idealist. For many years, I tended to favor the concept of a one-state solution, but done in ways that all benefit, with Israel carrying enormous responsibility, being the stronger power in the partnership, but to doing this as a partnership so that high degrees of autonomy, of benign autonomy, can occur. Settlements can, cities like Ariel, for example, in the West Bank, and many others who are well established, can live in a state of good coexistence. I say that's more based in idealism. The reality is the human condition. And the human condition, which is, you get some very extreme positions on both sides, and extreme positions that actually breed violence. And if that's the case, then we have to realistically look at other options where we live with separate states, policed separately, with a high degree of cooperation between our security services and politicians to enable that coexistence with mutual borders to exist. Because the reality is, for Palestinians, that they need Israel. In actual fact, Israel needs Palestinians. Huge amount of our workforce are Palestinian, building industry just being one of those. If there was an independent state of Palestine, they don't have a port. The enclaves are separated, so there's not a continuity between the different enclaves of, let's say, West Bank, Jericho, Gaza particularly. So how are they actually going to exist without basically being supported by Israel or the international community? There's so many pluses and minuses to both. And then you get this, terrible situation of emotion out of control because of the October 7th calamity and atrocities, and then the response, so heavy, so intentional, and resulting in, 1.7 million Gazans living atrocious conditions in midwinter. It should make all of our hearts bleed for that situation. It's untenable. Even the goals that were voiced from our Prime Minister and military high command of eradicating Hamas so that it could never rise again, restoration of our hostages brought home, all of them, this sort of thing. Here we are 3.5 months down the line, and was it yesterday? There was a massive rocket barrage from southern Gaza Strip into Tel Aviv. 80% of the tunnels, Hamas tunnels, by accounts from the Israel Defense Forces, are still totally tenable. These sorts of things. So one asks, as an Israeli, one asks the question, what have we actually achieved?
How do you think you should deal with Hamas?
We're deadly enemies, but we need to come to the negotiation table together. If we have not achieved the goals, and how long can Israel continue to sustain such a military position with the amount of manpower and military ordnance that is required to do that? But we're not really gaining so much ground. We're not achieving the goals, and we still have 136 hostages, dead or alive, we don't know, still in captivity. If we want to get anywhere, I think we're forced to come to the table, at least on a temporary basis, but a long-term temporary basis. That's my starting point, at least.
Wouldn't that be seen as a victory for Hamas, that they forced Israel to back down?
Well, the fact is, Bernie, I think they already are declaring a victory. There are no winners in war. Everybody basically declares victory. That's the nature of propaganda. They want to stay in power in the Gaza Strip. Israel does not want to see that happen. But we also are not coming up with any alternative solutions. We're going to have to negotiate.
Right. So even though, like for Hamas, they're very clearly stated in their charter the total destruction and eradication of Israel, you think you can still negotiate with them?
This was the position for decades of Fatah
Mhm.
under Yasser Arafat, we came to the table and have done reasonably well together.
Would you say the difference, like Fatah was very much a secular group,
Not
whereas
originally, it was highly militarized, and
oh
a
yeah,
certain
no,
amount of it
yeah,
still is.
yeah, not in terms of its military, but rather in terms of its ideology, it was very secular, not as strongly Islamist, say, as Hamas
No,
is.
that's true. Their basis was far more nationalistic. And you're right. Hamas is as a strong, I'm going to use this term, ally of Iran, which is Shiite, and Hezbollah in the north, which is Shiite. But interestingly enough, as far as I understand, most of Hamas, the factions in Gaza, are Sunni, and there's strong conflict between Shiite and Sunni. But at the same time, we're talking about Islamic ideology being at the root, the core of their policies, and they see themselves in a state of jihad, holy war against the interlopers, the Jews, the Zionists, and a need to eradicate us. It makes it tough for the negotiating table. I don't think it's just based in Islamic theology. There's also a strong nationalism involved.
In terms of the Christian community within Israel, whether in the West Bank or in the Israeli controlled areas, we're seeing the churches growing, or the number of Christians is growing in the Israeli controlled areas, but actually shrinking in Gaza and the West Bank. Is that your perception of what's happening?
Oh, absolutely. Christians within Palestine, West Bank, depending on your terminology, the Christian community is a shrinking community. It's really the devoted that are hanging in there. Among them, many of my friends and colleagues, even among some of them, their kids, the next generation, going, "We've got no hope. We've got no employment. We've got no future. Let's go join our cousins in Detroit, or let's head for Australia. We've got to get out of here." And I get it. In Israel proper, the Arab Christian community there, or Arab community, Muslims and Christians, have seen a steady development of coexistence, and more than that, opportunity opening up in all fields of academia, medicine, engineering, high tech, pharmaceuticals, classes at universities and hospitals, staff, doctors, as many Arabs as you do Jewish. So their lot has certainly improved enormously over the years. They've wisely learned, work out how to live in coexistence, and that's also reflected in the Christian communities. You see them as being effective, as growing, evangelistic, lots of cooperation between Jewish brothers, counterparts in our Messianic communities, this sort of thing. So it's a very, very different picture. These days, I openly reflect on us being really three separate communities within the believing world. You have the Palestinian Christians, West Bank, Gaza, Jericho, and then you have the Israeli Messianic community, and that's very diverse community because so many immigrants from various parts of the world. And then the Arab Christian community, which has, generations of strong history of being effective in the land, effective for the gospel.
So what would be the situation of Muslim background believers in general in both the Israeli controlled areas and in the Palestinian areas?
In the Palestinian areas, it's really, really tough being an MBB, and they have to be very careful. Their lives can be threatened very easily. Often they will have to be extricated. I have colleagues that working with them within the West Bank, and it's very different to the context, let's say, Morocco. where the Christian community of Morocco, for the most part, is from a Muslim background, tolerated to a large extent by the government, and do quite well. Even their pastoral and teaching staff all from Muslim backgrounds. On the contrary, within both the West Bank and Arab Christian community in Israel, the vast majority come from a traditional Christian historic church background, with exceptions. A movement, let's say in the Greater Jerusalem area, a movement like the Alliance Church has had a very evangelistic, and they've had I would say, a really one of the greatest success rate amongst people from Muslim backgrounds, and are very supportive. Now, within Israel, their integration possibilities are greater, but nevertheless not simple. It's actually very similar to the earlier days last century with Jewish believers, where it was not atypical for, a Jewish family discovering a son or daughter that had become a follower of Yeshua, of Jesus, and they would hold funeral services for them. They didn't exist anymore for them. Well, now we see that within the Muslim communities to some extent. There are a lot of parallels there. But when you meet some of these MBBs and their devotion and fervor for the Messiah, it's inspiring.
Well, maybe we should close up there. Just wondering if there are any final things that you would like to say, if you had a message for the Church of Australia on how to think about what's going on in the Middle East and what we should pray for. What would be the things here?
My appeal, if only my appeal would be to the Christians communities of Australia, for Australasia. My appeal would be to be very cautious with the information you're receiving through media, social media, even from Christian sources. But be very, very cautious. Understand in the situation of war, propaganda prevails. And that's typical of how history is written. You need to ask who's paying for the history, who's writing it, and what are the goals of that. Historians will, this is a good lesson in history classes. But this is what happens in war. So we have to take things, how do we put it down under, with a grain of salt. And I think as a result, my appeal would be kingdom orientated in the way we pray, the way we encourage one another. Don't be afraid, as our Lord taught us, don't be afraid to reach out to those of the other side. Your conversation, for example, with your friend, Jihad, is very important. It's really important for him to know a Christian client who is open to listen to him. We all have a narrative. Our narratives are inevitably going to conflict, collide, particularly when it comes to the epicenter of Israel, Palestine, and our Middle East region. It's so conflicted. The conflict is enormously complex. And so we have a calling on our lives to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be known as the children of God. And I think that would be my bottom line. It's not for the faint-hearted. It's for those of us that believe in the power of prayer, and also applying our faith in good works and reaching out, of providing support, sustenance, and encouragement to the others on the other side of the conflict. That would always be my bottom line.
Great. Look, thank you so much for your time and for your insight and understanding of the situation, and for being willing to share that with us.
Total pleasure.
God bless. Thank you.